Hello everyone, this is George David, President of CCMI and publisher of the Voice Report. Welcome to our program, the ABCs of Telecom Contract Negotiations. And before I turn it over to our speaker, Laura McDonald, I'd like to give you a little insight as to why we put this program together. It's intended primarily for folks who will be attending the conference, but we think it's got value even beyond that. And the main reason is, and for those of you who have attended the conference or will be coming, you'll appreciate this, it's a very fast-paced 2 days. It starts at 8:30 in the morning on Monday and runs pretty much nonstop until Tuesday afternoon around 5 o'clock. And the program is filled with lots of acronyms and industry terms, some legal terms, and we want to make sure that folks get the most that they possibly can out of the conference. So rather than have people show up cold and start wondering and looking at each other when they hear an unfamiliar term, we've decided to put this 1-hour program together to quickly get you up to speed on the terms that you'll be hearing, some of the acronyms you'll be hearing, and some of the concepts you'll be hearing so that you've got much better context for the conference itself. And like I said previously, we think even if you do not plan to attend the conference, you'll find some value in this as a learning tool. So with that, we encourage you to enjoy it, listen to it. If you are going to the conference, you'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions at the conference. And we encourage you also to share this with your colleagues. We think it's very valuable information. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to our expert speaker, Laura McDonald. Laura, I'm going to leave it with you now.
George, thanks for that very nice introduction and overview of the purpose of today's webinar. And I'd like to welcome everyone and appreciate your attending. I'd like to start out by introducing myself. My name is Laura McDonald. I'm a partner at Levine, Blazak, Block & Boothby. We often go by LB3. It's easier to spell and a lot quicker to say. LB3 is a boutique law firm, and we're dedicated to doing telecommunications and IT technology deals for large enterprise customers. So we have been doing this for many years. We are ranked Tier 1 nationally and locally in communications by U.S. News and World Report. We have an affiliate, Tech Caliber, TC2, and TC2 is on the number side. We're on the legal side, they're on the number side. They help clients maximize their return and strategize and develop their telecom procurement. They do a full range of sourcing, benchmarking, optimization, and technology consulting. LB3 and TC2 will be leading the upcoming CCMI seminar. As George pointed out, it is 2 days that are very intense and very packed. And this is a way to help get you ready for that and think about it before you go. What this is really geared towards folks who are newer to the telecom space. If you have been doing procurement but suddenly have taken on responsibility for telecom, or have been doing IT and now have added telecom to your side, or perhaps you were in the telecom arena for a while, but it's been several years and now you're back with the responsibilities for it, this should be a good introduction or overview or primer for you. If you've been doing telecom for the last 15 years, this is probably going to be too high level for you. But I think it would be very useful for anybody new that you're bringing along. We will be going into everything that I'm talking about at a much more intense and granular level at the upcoming conference, and we welcome questions, as George said. It's a great opportunity to bring your questions and to talk to your peers about what they're doing. What we're going to be talking about today is, as far as the overview of this, is the players who are involved, who's in the marketplace in the telecom arena, the carriers, the equipment providers, the regulators, what roles do they play, what names are you going to be hearing. Also, what services are out there? What are the services that you're purchasing or have been purchasing or are likely to be considering to purchase in the upcoming year or two? And then finally, we're going to look a little bit at your contracts and the negotiations process. And for that portion of this, we're really going to be looking at things that you should examine before you come to the conference so that you can be as prepared as possible and ready to absorb some of the information. And also so that you can help select which of the many breakouts are offered, because there are more options than there are time. So this will give you a little bit of a chance to think about that before you come to the upcoming conference. If you haven't registered, I think most of the people on the line have, but if you haven't registered, there's a link here that you can go to do your registration. So let's get started with the players. generally, when you're talking about the carrier side of things, people tend to put things into two buckets, a Tier 1 provider and a Tier 2 provider. Also, as George mentioned, in the area of telecommunications, there are tons of acronyms. And we'll be using a lot of those acronyms today. You'll hear a lot of them at the conference. The good news is that when you come to the conference, you'll also get a little short glossary, and I think it's about 200 words, that will go through the acronyms. So you'll be able to refer to them, and you'll know what we're talking about when we're talking about an ILEC or a CLEC or an IXC. But I'm going to go over that a little bit today on our webinar. An incumbent local exchange carrier, an ILEC, is a carrier who, let me step back a second. We used to have here in the United States Ma Bell. In the early 80s, as a result of antitrust action, it was broken up into Ma Bell, which was retained the AT&T name and did the long distance and international services, and the Baby Bells. There were 7 regional Baby Bells. And the regional Baby Bells provided the local services, and those were the incumbent local exchange carriers. And then, each of them had a different name depending on where you're located. Then there's the inter-exchange carriers. AT&T Corp, Ma Bell, was an inter-exchange carrier, meaning that it transported traffic over state lines. There's also competitive local exchange carriers. These are the folks who developed really in the early 90s and through the 90s to compete against the Baby Bells, the SBCs, the Bell South, the Bell Atlantic, the 9Xs of the world. And MCI started out as both a CLEC and an inter-exchange carrier. There's mobile service providers, the wireless guys. We have a number of sessions on wireless because it is a world among itself. And we also have overseas providers. What I'll be spending most of my time on today is a little bit more domestic focused, U.S. focused, but we do have, and most enterprise customers have an international footprint. And so they're buying services both in the United States and outside of the United States. And we do have sessions that address international issues, and we do talk about international issues in the upcoming conference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who are some of the international players. So who are the Tier 1 players? We'll start with our friends at AT&T, since they were really the initiator of the U.S. phone service that we all know and love. AT&T falls into 3 different categories: AT&T Corp, AT&T Inc., and AT&T Mobility. And as we go through the U.S. players, one thing you'll notice is a real patent place. There have been lots of mergers and divestitures and purchases, and we'll talk a little bit about that. If you want to go into the history more, a number of us would love to do it, but we only have so much time today. AT&T Corp provides the intrastate, interstate, and international side of the AT&T telecommunications network. They have some CLEC affiliates, TCG, but since their merger with what was at that point SBC, Southwestern Bell Corp, the TCG, their CLEC has played a much smaller role, and SBC and their other affiliate, Bell South, that was acquired in 2006, have really been the primary local exchange providers, the ILEC. You have AT&T Mobility. Again, I said there's been a lot of spin-offs and changes in this world. AT&T was, at one point, there was Singular Wireless that was co-owned by SBC and Bell South. AT&T spun off their wireless, purchased by them, and of course then SBC bought AT&T and then bought Bell South, so now it is all AT&T Wireless or Mobility again. The other really premier Tier 1 provider of telecom services here in the United States is Verizon. Verizon was formed from the merger of a number of the Baby Bells, for example, 9X, Atlantic, and also the acquisition of MCI, who, of course, ironically, was one of the first big competitors against AT&T in the inter-exchange market. And that Verizon purchased MCI in 2005. Verizon also has a wireless component. Unlike AT&T, Verizon does not own 100% of its wireless component. It owns only 55% with Vodafone, which is a UK-based global carrier. It's one of the largest global carriers, and it owns the other 45%. Another 2 providers that are often, or 3 providers that are often grouped in this Tier 1, although really don't have quite the market share that AT&T and Verizon have, are Qwest, Sprint, and T-Mobile. And let's start with Qwest. Qwest has recently been acquired by CenturyLink. CenturyLink is also a newer entrant into this market that's really built by acquisition, and we'll talk about them in a few minutes. Qwest, at various times in its life, has been a strong contender for enterprise business, but that is very dependent on instances that it's faced. It's various mergers and acquisitions and spinoffs. You'll see there's a little bit of information in here, but it has just recently been acquired by CenturyLink, and so you'll start seeing the migration of the Qwest name from the Qwest name to CenturyLink. Next is Sprint Nextel. Sprint purchased Nextel. It is both a wireless business and a wireline business, but a lot of its focus really is on the wireless side. It is a strong wireless provider. And then you have T-Mobile, which is one of the stronger wireless providers. Certainly doesn't have the market share that AT&T and Verizon have, but it was an affiliate of Deutsche Telecom, and AT&T has been in the press quite a bit. Just this March has announced that it has an agreement with T-Mobile to purchase T-Mobile. So that is going to have to go through the whole regulatory approval process. And at least here in the Washington area where I'm located, almost every week there is a full-page ad in the Washington Post about why this is a good deal for consumers, because they're trying to influence their regulators, which we'll talk about in a second, and of course other influence players, the legislature, the Congress. Let's move on to who are the Tier 2 players. There are a number of Tier 2 players. Again, this list ebbs and flows, and the strength of these companies ebbs and flows based on what's going on in the market. Level 3 is often considered one of the top Tier 2 providers. It provides both IXC, interstate, and intrastate, and wholesale services. It's just acquired Global Crossing. Global Crossing has its own very, very history, including a bankruptcy and criminal actions that took place during the bubble. But Level 3 is one of the larger Tier 2 providers. You also have Paytech. Paytech grew up as a CLAC. It really started serving the university market, but it has grown and also serves a lot of the enterprise market. It has recently announced just this summer that it will be purchased by Windstream. So that process is going through, that merger process, approval process is going through. XO Communications, TW Telecom, not to be confused with Time Warner Telecom, that is not the same entity anymore. Our other providers, CenturyLink, which has really grown by acquisition, is one of the providers. You also have Windstream, the one that I mentioned was purchasing Paytech. These are all facility-based. At the bottom, you'll see Granite. Granite is a little bit different in the Tier 2 space because it is a pure resale provider. What it does is it resells local services and intrastate services that are provided by primarily the ILEC. So they have a different market focus and market structure, but they're also a name that you, if you're representing enterprise customers, may run across. There are also international players, numerous ones. There is no one carrier who can say that they cover the entire globe. It's obvious why that would be almost impossible, but there are certain carriers who have a bigger presence. AT&T and Verizon are international players, but since we've already talked about them, let's talk about some of the others. Orange is an international player. It is owned by France Telecom. It provides a lot of services to enterprise users. Its sweet spot really is managed services. That's what it likes to hold itself out to its enterprise customers, is really providing value. You'll notice in here it talks about primary focus. When I go through these and I mention their primary focus, it certainly isn't their exclusive focus, but they're really, again, their sweet spot. Singtel is an international but with a focus in Asia-Pac. BT, British Telecom, that is international but with a focus in the EU. NTT is also focused in Asia-Pac. Tata Communications has grown out of India. It was actually at one time owned by the government and is no longer, but it has also an Asia-Pac focus. Telefonica is Spain and South America, and Colt Group is mainly in Europe, but it also has a sweet spot for financial services companies. In addition, we've talked a little bit about the carriers, and now let's talk a little bit about some of the equipment manufacturers, because you can't really buy one without the other. And each of these carriers are heavily invested in their infrastructure and equipment that is developed and manufactured by these companies. Cisco is pretty much at the top of the list. It's an amazing company that was just founded in 1984. It really was one of the first producers of router technology, and has grown tremendously over the last 2 and I guess 3 decades. One of its main competitors is Avaya. Avaya just recently purchased when Nortel went into bankruptcy its enterprise group at auction. So Avaya is one of Cisco's competitors. Ciena is an equipment manufacturer that has a sweet spot or a focus on packet optical equipment or Ethernet-related equipment. So in the DWDM space, they sell a lot. Alcatel-Lucent. Lucent may sound familiar to some of you. Lucent was the part of the Bell Lab that was, Lucent actually spun off Avaya, and then I think in 2006 or thereabout had the merger with Alcatel, which is a French-based company. Juniper is another name that you probably see out there for equipment. You might also, less familiar but probably going, is Huawei, which is a Chinese company that really wants to be a primary competitor of Cisco. Nortel, as I mentioned, used to be, you always used to hear about Cisco, Avaya, and Nortel. Nortel, unfortunately, went into bankruptcy, and so it is no longer in the equipment market. Although just recently we just replaced our Nortel phone, so you may have a Nortel phone at your office still. So they still have a presence in this field. You'll also often hear something called VAR partners. VAR partners or channel partners are resellers of equipment. And Cisco uses this arrangement a lot. You might have a negotiation with Cisco to figure out if you get a discount off of your Cisco services, but you're not going to purchase them from Cisco. Except for the rarest of instances, you're going to purchase them through one of Cisco's channel partners or VARs. That could be AT&T or Verizon, or it could be another provider that's out there, but you end up having negotiations with somebody other than Cisco to purchase Cisco equipment. We've talked about the players, the carriers. We've talked about the equipment manufacturers. Now let's talk about the regulators, because this is one of the reasons why telecommunications deals are so different than other deals out there. Purchasing your network is different than purchasing PCs or laptops or pencils or paper, because it's a heavily regulated industry. And that impacts both the mindset of the carriers that you're dealing with, what you can do, where you complain, and how things are packaged and presented. Here in the United States, you have a dual system of regulation. You have a federal and a state. On the federal level, you have the Federal Communications Commission, and it has jurisdiction over interstate and international services. It also has jurisdiction over things that are mixed, because in the telecom world, particularly the telecom world we live in today, that line between services and what is their jurisdictional nature is not always clear. The FCC also has jurisdiction, some, over information services. And there's a big difference between what's a basic telecommunications service, and what's an information service. And we'll go into this in more detail in one of the opening sessions at the conference. But for right now, you should know that things like your internet service are information services. And while the FCC does have some regulatory authority over them, it is not as robust as it is over your AT&T and Verizons of the world. There has been a lot of political wrangling and numerous lawsuits that have been going on as to how different services are categorized and what things fall into, because in some instances carriers want the protection of regulations and sometimes that they don't. And the same, frankly, goes for enterprise customers. That's on the federal side, and that's really governed by the Communications Act of '34 as amended. On the state side, each state has a regulatory body, whether it's called the PSC or DTE or PUC, that is similar in its nature and its goals as the FCC, but it really looks at interstate and local telecommunications services. And often there's either legislation or even in some states their constitution that looks at the regulatory authority of these regulators. They work both in tandem and sometimes in tension with the FCC. Abroad, outside of the United States, there are also regulators, and how active those regulators are depends on the nation that you're dealing with. So there is a wide range of it. Here are some names of some common ones that you might run across. Ofcom in the UK. You might deal with DOT, or the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, if you have services or locations in India. You might, if you're in Australia, it would be the Australian Communications and Media Authority. You might be dealing with the Ministry of Information Industry in China. But what you should know is, regardless of where you are, if you're buying telecommunications service, those telecommunications services and potentially you as an enterprise purchaser will be subject to regulation. Now in the U.S., it's the carriers who are regulated, and that may flow through or have an impact on you. But in other jurisdictions, it can be both the services, the carriers, and sometimes the purchasers of services. So you should always be aware that that's out there, because you don't want them to run afoul of a regulatory authority. Now that we've quickly run through who are the players, let's talk a little bit about what are the services. And these are the services that, again, you're probably currently purchasing, you might have purchased over the last few years, or you're likely to purchase over the next few years. And I've really broken them down into three different categories. First is your traditional voice. This, you might have heard of the PSTN, the Public Switch Telephone Network. This is what we all grew up with. When you pick up the phone and you make a phone call, it goes over the PSTN. Offices, until about 5 years ago, pretty much anytime you picked up the phone and made a local call or even an interstate call, it was going to go over the PSTN. There's private lines, which is a type of dedicated access. There's conferencing, toll-free. All of those types of things fall into the traditional voice category. Then there's the traditional data category. That also has private and dedicated lines, but until recently, those were separate. In fact, when I first started working in the telecom arena almost 2 decades ago, the data side of an enterprise and the voice side of the enterprise often didn't really talk to each other. And when they did talk, they used different vocabulary. That has changed dramatically. And so if you're someone, as I mentioned, that's coming back into telecom, that may be one of the first things that you notice. But in the traditional data, you might have used frame relay and ATM. Now, those are technologies that were very big 10 years ago, but are really legacy technologies today. So we're not going to talk about them. But a few of you may have still ATM or frame residuals in your network, depending on your size and your experience and what you're looking for. Sonic rings is another traditional type of data. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's a third category, which I've just labeled new and converged. This is where you have the convergence of the voice and data, some of the newer technologies that are out there, and some of the more exciting developments in the telecom and infrastructure arena. And most of those are IP-based services, such as MPLS, Ethernet access, zip trunking. Regardless of who you are, there will be some similarities in your telecom service purchase and procurement. And that will be similar whether or not you're manufacturing widgets, you're selling widgets, you're transporting widgets, or you're financing the company that makes the widgets. There are commonalities, but there are also differences. And those differences are really dependent on the location of the company, what their company's needs are, what their costs are, what their existing infrastructure is. This makes it very difficult for there to be substantially similar customers, a term that the carriers like to bandy about, but we've found in our many years of doing deals there are very few of, because each company has their own specific needs. For example, if you are an insurance company and you have a bunch of small offices around the country, you're going to have a very different network infrastructure and needs than somebody who has 2 huge data centers that's tracking information on each coast of the country. If you're someone who's invested a lot of money into infrastructure, you may be less willing to do an outsourcing where somebody else is taking care of it, or move to a new technology because you don't want to incur the new costs associated with it. When we're working with enterprise customers, there are certain factors that across the board influence what they're going to purchase and how they structure the deal. First and foremost is price. The other factors are speed and throughput. Are you running applications on this that need to be very quick and that don't respond well to what we call jitter or latency? How reliable does this need to be? Are you in the financial services industry where you have to have this working 24 hours every minute of the day, and with backup and redundancy, or it could be a disaster? Are you in a company that having 100% availability is important, but it's not mission critical? What about security? Are you in a field like the healthcare, where you're transmitting a lot of information that is subject to HIPAA? Or again, the financial services area. You may care more about the security than some other company. Flexibility and capability. How much churn do you have in your business? How much do you need to turn up sites or turn down sites? Are you a retail one where you're always adding new sites and turning and ending locations or franchises? So that's something that you want to look at. You'll notice that price is in here 3 times, and you might be saying, Laura, you've made a typo. In fact, you've made 2 typos. You've put price in here 3 times. I put price in here 3 times deliberately because that ultimately is one of the most important factors to almost every enterprise customer. These other ones are important, but price is often the deciding factor. Let's talk a little bit about the individual services, again, at a very high level since we only have an hour. In the telecom arena, if you're going to live and breathe and eat telecom, you have to know your acronyms, and you also have to be able to look at diagrams. Those are the 2 things that go hand in hand. So I have some diagrams for you, so you can look at those as well. This first one is the legacy voice network. I would say 6 years ago, what you see right here would be just pretty much the same for almost every customer out there. If you see the telephone up there with the local loop, that would be you calling from home to a corporation, let's say Apple, over on the West Coast. You'd be using your local loop, sometimes that's called the last mile. That's usually provided by the ILEC, the incumbent local exchange carrier. They take the call to their central office. There's an elaborate system of signaling, SS7, that lets the system know whether or not the line that you're calling is free or busy. And then it's switched through the PSTN, the public switch telephone network, to the PBX at the company that you're calling on the West Coast. Or you might be a retailer. So instead of going through just a local loop, you need more capacity. You have dedicated access, local access. That might be provided by the ILEC. It might be provided by a Verizon or AT&T or a Sprint. It'll go to the carrier's POP. It'll be carried across to the POP closest to the location that it's served, and it's sent off at the end. So this is your traditional model. Next model is the private line. This is kind of the bottom side of the slide we just looked at, and there's a dedicated local access. When we're looking at the advantages to private line services, they're very reliable unless you have a backhaul or they were improperly installed. They usually have a high reliability. They're very secure. Nobody else is using that line. It's dedicated to you. It has whatever capacity you pick for it. So if you get a T1 or a T45 or OC3, it's whatever you decide for that private line that you need. Now the problem is once you get it, it's not very scalable. It's not flexible. If you find that you need more capacity or less capacity, your only options are to terminate this private line and install a new one, which could usually takes at least 45 days, if not longer, to do if it's a larger capacity size. Or, terminate it, usually pay a termination penalty and get a smaller capacity line. So, and these are fairly pricey because, again, they're dedicated only to the customer. This is a simple example, but in most enterprises that were transporting information based on a private line model, you really had a very complex web of private lines. Let's assume that you had a headquarters in New York and you had 6 other headquarters across the country, you would want private lines probably to all of those, and you'd want each location to be able to talk to the other, so you would probably have interconnected private lines. You would really have, think of a roadmap or a wheel mentality. You would have a lot invested in those private lines to make them work. Now, those private lines could be used either solely for voice or solely for data. In this example, it's for data. So again, the advantages are that they're very secure and reliable. The disadvantages are they're not that scalable and they're expensive. Another technology that is more legacy but was very popular and still is probably in use in a number of enterprises are sonnet rings. And these, the advantage of the sonnet rings is they had a self-healing nature. So if a backhoe came and put a cut in the sonnet ring, it would redirect itself. For this reason, they had tremendous SLAs associated with it. There were carriers who were willing to give credit if you even had a minute of outage because they were designed to avoid that. They were, again, dedicated to the user, so they're very reliable. They were very secure. They had some flexibility because you could add and take away channels, but for the most part, if you didn't size it right, you were in the same situation that you had with the ring, in that you had to resize it and reorder and go through that whole process if you needed either more capacity or less capacity. Where we've really moved to is a VPN environment. VPN is a virtual private network. A private network is configured, it's a private network that's configured within a public network, and that can either be over the internet, but most likely in the enterprise environment over the carrier's network. And what it allows is customers to take advantage of economies of scale and to create wide area networks, WAN, or to connect to local area networks, LAN. It also allows a number of different technology or services to create a VPN. And it avoided, what it allowed is in here in the area, the cloud that you see, the managed IP network, it allowed you to avoid some of the expense and rigidity of using private lines to connect up. One of the most common mechanisms or tools for creating a VPN is multi-protocol label switching, MPLS. And this has really been where most enterprise customers have focused in the last 4 to 5 years as far as moving their network. And the MPLS is a network management protocol, and it emulates some of the properties of the circuit switch network using a packet switch network. It also allows what's called class of service, and class of service allows the system to distinguish, or you to distinguish to the priority of traffic. It also allows you to put voice and data and video all over the same network. So you can say, my video gets first priority, your video and voice go first, my internet traffic can be last as far as prioritizing the delivery of this packet. MPLS has a lot of advantages because it's very scalable. It's protocol agnostic. It, as I said, allows you to carry both data and voice. And it really has become the technology that has made ATM and frame almost obsolete or legacy services. Now let's talk a little bit about converged services. These are where the industry is going, where there is a merger of the voice and data. It is no longer possible to have an enterprise where the voice and data side doesn't talk to each other. They're the one and the same. We're going to spend a little bit on voice over IP, SIP trunking, and cloud computing. Voice over IP, I'm assuming most people by now know what it is. It's voice over internet protocol. And it really is a replacement of the old TDM, or time division multiplexing method of transporting voice. And it allows you to converge your voice conversation into IP packets that can be transported over the network. Usually this is done by replacing old PBXs with IP PBXs. You could also take it a step farther so that your handsets are connected up and you have IP handsets, which allow wonderful new technologies and conversions that many enterprises have moved to. Ironically, where it has usually been the enterprises who have adopted technology first and then the consumer markets that have followed, with voice over IP, it's really been the opposite. You've had a lot of folks out there doing Skype. Many of you have probably used Skype. You know, I have, my parents will use Skype. So, you know, it is a technology that a lot of people are using. My kids use Skype or similar type services. And it has really The change has really started from the residential side, in part because a lot of people weren't willing to give up their reliable old system, and they weren't willing to do some of the legwork and the cost to replace their equipment. That's not true for everyone. I recently, I guess it wasn't recently anymore, but a while ago spoke on a panel and had the opportunity to speak with a person who was helping the Smithsonian change over to a VoIP solution. And it was an easy decision for them because at the time they still had rotary phones and they had servers that were taking up enormous amounts of space. So when you're looking at the cost and reliability factor, the Smithsonian needs reliable calls, but not like the banking industry. And they certainly could use the extra space that the old non-IP servers were taking up. So it was an easy decision for them. One of the first areas that enterprise customers were really using voice over IP as part of an MPLS network, where they would take voice over IP and put it over their MPLS network, so it would be internal communications that were covered this way. And here's a diagram for you that kind of spells that out. Again, all of this we'll be going into in much greater detail at the upcoming conference. The wonderful thing about the MPLS technology, remember, it's protocol agnostic, but it also creates the same any-to-any capacity that you need and you have in the PSTN. So it was a natural for customers, for enterprise customers to use as the first adaptation of voice over IP. Where it's really moving now, and the buzzword of today, is SIP trunking. First of all, just a word to the wise, I don't know where they came up with the name SIP trunking, but there are no trunks involved. That is just a misnomer. And if somebody tries to sell you a SIP trunk, you need to get down as to what they're actually selling you. Because basically SIP trunking is a business class Skype. It uses VoIP standards that enables enterprises to reduce your cost, to scale local services. Local services have always been the bottleneck. There's enormous cost associated both with maintaining those copper pairs or the last mile transit. And the VoIP is a mechanism that allows companies to get rid of their PRIs, not all of them, but many of them. Because for a typical PRI and a T1, you get 23 channels. You can have 23 conversations going on. But because of the SIP trunking technology, you're allowed to create a greater bandwidth efficiency. So you get up to 45 concurrent calls on that same T1. That's where you see the reduced cost and the scalability. You can use your IP PBXs. There's some workarounds. You can even use your regular PBXs. You can provide for a single network for all your local, long-distance, and international communication. You can consolidate and simplify your management and operations. So there are a lot of very interesting things associated with voice over IP, and you have that price element. The problem with voice over IP in the enterprise space is really it is not as mature of a technology as the old PSTN, which has been around forever. So carriers are selling it in different ways. The folks that you deal with from the carrier side, they have more knowledge or less knowledge about the service. So it's a little more work on the enterprise scale to make sure that what you're procuring meets your needs. The other issue that you need to think about when you're doing this is how you're structured and how that affects your relationship with your existing carrier, whether your existing carrier is the right carrier for providing you this SIP service. Now, the carriers are interesting on this. The CLECs of the world are strong proponents of SIP trunking. The ILECs, or the Tier 1, some of the old Tier 1 providers like AT&T, think it's a great idea, but they also cannibalizes the SBCs and the old Verizons of the world. So they've addressed that differently. That's something we'll go into more detail at the upcoming conference. We have a lot of information on SIP because it's both a beautifully simple and a completely complex service offering. The other buzzword of late is cloud computing. Cloud computing is essentially a number of different offerings which allow you to consolidate resources in the quote-unquote cloud rather than run them locally. The three primary flavors of cloud computing are infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. Now, infrastructure as a service is the one that most enterprises are beginning to look to carriers like Verizon and AT&T, but certainly in no means the same way that they look at them for the more legacy services. and Verizon and AT&T will refer to this as CAS, Computing as a Service. Some of the essential characteristics of cloud computing is the service is hosted and managed by the vendor. It's made available to customers remotely via IP-based network. It's designed on a shared service multi-tenant platform. There's a lot of elasticity and scalability. So when we look at the characteristics that people are looking at when making decisions, it's high on that end. There's a lot of self-provisioning tools that are available. It's available under subscription, and usage is monitored on a pay-as-you-go pricing, which is very different than the normal scenario in the telecom world. There's often some confusion when people are talking about cloud computing between a public cloud and a private or a hybrid cloud. In a public cloud, you have a third-party provided infrastructure. It resides outside of your corporate firewall, and all customers share the same IT resources. When you're talking about a private or a hybrid cloud, it's really a much different course. It uses virtualization technologies often within the enterprise's own data center to create a cloud for computing. So it is different. This is another session we're going to be talking about in much more detail at the upcoming conference. And then there's some additional new services, some of them newer than others, that are out there and your enterprise may be purchasing or considering purchasing. First of all, there has been a huge growth in the Ethernet world, and there's been a lot of replacement of SONET rings with DWDM rings. DWDM is dense wavelength division multiplexing. And the advantage that DWDM has over the old SONET is it has much more flexibility and scalability. So, and it has some of the reliability of the old SONET network. The pricing is still variable, but it has, so that's still up for negotiation, so you'll have to look at it. The other area that we're seeing more of is dark fiber. Dark fiber really is fiber optic cable that's not being used, it's not lit. There is a lot of dark fiber here in the United States. It used to be in the past that telecommunication companies would sell dark fiber to each other, or lease it would be the proper term, but they really were not doing that to their enterprise customers because it was very valuable to them. But due to the glut in the market and the changes in the market, the enterprise telecommunications carriers are leasing their dark fiber. The primary purchasers of the dark fiber tend to be in the financial institutions area, where they're using it for redundancy or for infrastructure, or to have as a backup. So that's where we're seeing that. Now let's talk a little bit about contracts and negotiations, which is the core focus of the upcoming conference. In the best of all worlds, if you have a telecommunications contract, it's going to be structured like what you see on the screen. There's something called tariffs. Again, we will get into this. It's very important, but there's an obscure regulatory world that applies to telecommunications, some, not all. And in your contract structure, the tariff actually has, it preempts everything by state law or federal law, depending on what applies. Then you have usually a master services agreement, and this is where most of your terms and conditions are contained. Then you have underneath that service attachments that will be, or scheduled, each of the different vendors calls it something different, but they look at the particular services that you're purchasing. They'll have SLAs in it, they'll have pricing in it, they'll have service-specific terms in it, and they'll fall neatly under your MSA, and there won't be any conflict, and it'll all smoothly go together. And then under those, you'll often have service orders, which may have specific terms as to a particular circuit, but you also have something called service guides or schedules, again, depending on it. These are what used to be tariffs, are no longer tariffs. Again, stay tuned. We'll talk about that at the conference. These are written by the carriers. They're incorporated into almost all contracts, and they're pages long. They are written from the vendor's point of view, so they are not customer favorable. Some of it's just pricing. Some of it's SLA. Some of it are service descriptions. Some of it's benign. But there are also many contract terms in there that you should be aware of. And you also want to make sure that those are last in the order of precedence when you're looking at a contract. Unfortunately, what happens many times when I'm dealing with a customer, if they haven't really been paying that close attention to the telecommunications procurement, is you'll have a contract structure that looks like this. You'll have tariffs and service guides taking precedence over negotiated terms, which should never happen, at least on the service side. You may have more than one MSA, and it may not be clear which services fall under what. These could be amended 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, and even the carriers can't keep track of how things go together, or things get left out that were critical, but they were in Amendment number 2 and then inadvertently overridden by Amendment number 9. You'll have service attachments, you'll have service orders, you'll have standalone ones. You'll have one office that's entered into an agreement that's different than the rest of the corporate. So it's very important when you are putting together your telecom process, you're putting together your negotiations, when you're looking at your structure, that you take a good look at your contract and see how they flow. This can be fixed. It may take a little bit of time to be fixed, but it's not going to be fixed if you don't know about it. There are certain key provisions that need to be in every, or looked for, in every telecommunications contract. Now, when we draft kind of a robust enterprise MSA, it can be well over 100 pages. We're not going through 100 pages of terms and conditions here. We do talk a lot about terms and conditions at the conference. Let me focus on some of the most critical ones to you, because you should take a look at these before you come in your contract. First of all, what is the term of the services? Sometimes you'll have terms for the contract. Sometimes you'll have different terms for the underlying services themselves. Sometimes you'll have different terms for the individual service elements that you're purchasing. What is the term? Sometimes it's ambiguous and sometimes they conflict. Next thing is commitment. Most telecommunications contracts for large enterprise users have some type of a revenue commitment. You'll purchase X amount of dollars worth over a year or over 3 years. There are some instances where there are no commitments, but that is very, very rare. Even where you don't have a revenue commitment, you often have term commitments that you have to purchase a sonnet ring for 5 years. And if you terminate after 4 years, then you owe them a year of the service, and that goes down to the penalty. What happens when you have these commitments and you don't meet them? You were committed to spend $5 million and you only spent 3. You're committed to keep that DWDM ring for 5 years, and after 3 years you find that you've divested and you no longer need that ring, or you're moving to a new technology. There are penalties for those behaviors. If they're not in your contract, they're most likely in the applicable guide or where tariffs apply in the tariff. So you need to be aware of what those are. Sometimes they're more than 100%. It is more expensive to terminate a service with a carrier than it is to keep it. Your prices should be in there. These should be fixed prices. Your goal is to have your prices fixed for 95% of your services. There may be some that you buy here and there that it doesn't really matter to you, but for most of your services. You may go into your contracts and find that the prices aren't fixed. There might be prices in there, but these are prices that the carrier can change. Or there may just be discounts off of prices. Discounts off of prices are not fixed prices. You may have a 50%. If you're buying something for $10 and you get a 50% discount and they raise it to $20, that discount isn't so good anymore. So those are the things you want to look at. You also, when you're looking at your rate, particularly if you're looking at moving to a new carrier, you want to look at when those rates go into effect. Each carrier does it differently, and they often do it differently depending on the type of service that you're purchasing. So take a look at those. When you're looking at your contracting process, timing is key. It always takes more time than you think to do a telecommunications contract, particularly if you're doing a competitive bid. Figure out how much time you think you need and then double it. Because, as I said, it always takes longer than you think it's going to do. Do your homework. What services are you buying? What do you expect to buy? Look at those criteria that I outlined before. What's most important? Is it important that you have a flexibility? What type of capacity do you need? What's your existing infrastructure? What's your tolerance for risk? What type of security requirements? Are there regulatory requirements that are imposed on you? Find that out in advance, because that will actually speed your process. If you're finding this out in drips and drabs as you're trying to negotiate, you're going to find the carriers get upset because they feel like the ground is always moving, and it's going to take you longer. You need to look at all the interested parties within your organization, because it's not just procurement. You have a number of folks who need to be involved in this, and you should go out and talk to them about what they're looking for, what's worked and what's not worked. You need to know your leverage, because this is one of the biggest drivers as to what type of deal you get. If you don't have any leverage now, you're not going to get a good deal, but that doesn't mean you can't put yourself in a position where later you have better leverage. When you're looking at the process, the best way to get leverage and get good prices is to do a competitive, well-run RFP. You don't always have time to do an RFP. That may not be your best option right now. I understand that. Another approach is an RFI or a hybrid approach. That's something you can consider based on your time frame. Sometimes you just have to renew or refresh, but it should be part of a longer-term look of getting to where you want to be. Our goal is to have everyone who walks out of the conference in a much better position for understanding what their needs are and where they need to be to get the best deal they can get for their current situation, and to position themselves for next time around they're even in a better situation. So what's next? Again, in order to get the most you can out of the upcoming conference, look at your contracts. Look at what you're purchasing. Look at when your deal expires and how those terms work. Does everything expire at the same time? Do all your carriers? We always recommend that you have a multi-carrier environment. It just is better for you. It's better for redundancy, and it's better for keeping you in the position to get the best prices and terms. Consider what your short-term and long-term goals are. If you don't know, just start thinking about it, and you'll have a much better feel after you leave the conference. Look at your relationship with your carriers and who they have relationships with. If you go in and you talk honestly to any of the carriers, they want to be in a situation where they know the C levels and they have common discourse with C levels. They may be working with your operations, they may be working with your procurement, but they want that channel. So you need to make sure that you have that channel as well, so that the right message goes across to the vendors and within your organization. Who are your stakeholders? And come with a list of questions. And don't be afraid to ask questions at the conference. As I said earlier, one of the best advantages of this is the opportunity to interconnect with your peers, hear what they're doing, what's worked for them, what's not worked for them, and to ask questions of the folks who are speaking. As I indicated, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is much more. We look forward to meeting you. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Come up and say hello. As I said, there'll be a glossary, but I'm also more than willing to share some of the books and resources that I keep on my desk and available so you can use them as well. And thank you very much for your time today. And again, I look forward to meeting you in person. Take care.